Hello and welcome to AP Comparative Government. Today we're talking about one of our six states, Nigeria. Nigeria is our only less developed state. In many ways, it is the most troubled or perhaps challenged of any of our states. As the saying goes, as Nigeria goes, so goes the rest of sub Saharan Africa. It is Africa's most populous state with 190 million people, and that number is going to go up dramatically in the next 10 years. It is home to vast oil deposits, but 70% of those 190 million people live in poverty. The population is roughly evenly split between Catholic and Muslims. There's no real ethnic or national cohesive identity. It is, to that extent, our state of contrasts and the state that has, by far and away, the largest and most important cleavages. It's also a state with a troubled democratic past. In 2007, there was an election, but it was considered to be fraudulent by just about everybody. That being said, there's some reason for optimism. In 2011 and 2015, the elections actually were much, much, much cleaner. The biggest question about Nigeria is what is called the national question. How a state should be governed is something every citizen asks about their country. But in Nigeria, this remains an open question. In fact, many Nigerians argue that Nigeria should not be one country, it should be several, and this dilemma is known as the national question. Making matters worse, in the past, rather than trying to solve the many challenges and differences amongst the population in Nigeria, different authoritarian leaders have glossed over these problems with military force, making them even worse. Legitimacy in Nigeria is nearly non existent. In fact, it is by far the lowest of our six states. A lot of this has to do with the past. Since 1960, when Nigeria gained independence, and so it's obviously the youngest of any of our states, Nigeria has been ruled until roughly 2007 by military leaders. Even democratically elected presidents tended to be generals. People saw these regimes as corrupt and felt like there was just no reason, for example, to pay taxes. I mean, after all, what's the point of paying your taxes if it's just going to go straight into the national leader's bank account? Under British rule, Nigerians came to understand the value of the rule of law, which is probably why it hurts so much that rule of law does not exist in modern Nigeria. In fact, even while under British rule in 1914, Nigerians were allowed to craft a constitution. In the North, legitimacy is often based in Sharia, like it is in Iran. They have local police forces called Hizbah, which are responsible for enforcing Muslim social codes. In 2008, the federal government cracked down on those practices. But unfortunately, in recent years, the Hizbah has returned as the sovereignty of Nigeria's federal government has been seriously called into questions. This makes a lot of difficulties for Nigeria. It struggled with whether or not the Constitution is really going to be the law of the land, what we call constitutionalism, or whether it's just a piece of paper that leaders can toss aside when they're not interested in following it anymore. And as I mentioned, making matters worse, Nigeria has massive cleavages that divide its population and make it easier for these authoritarian leaders to take advantage of. So let's look a little bit at political history. In the pre colonial area, we have a couple of things going on. To the north, trade put people there in contact with Arab merchants. This is essentially along the Sahara. This caused northern Nigeria to convert to Islam early on, especially the elites. Initially, most politics the further south you go was very local, hence the importance of familial bonds or kinship. This is all very complicated because in some parts of the pre Columbian Nigeria, there were larger kingdoms. while in others, we're still talking about villages very much, and sometimes these overlapped. There were some democratic impulses during this period. Even at the village level, people expected their leaders to be accountable to the people. Leaders were representatives of the village. They were supposed to look out for their people, not their own interests. And of course, if we're going to talk about Nigeria at all, we have to talk about the Niger River, which is where Nigeria gets its name. This crucial river flows through Mali, Niger, and then ultimately it forms the end of Nigeria. And that's really where most of the oil is located. And that's why it's crucial to our understanding of this state. As I mentioned before, the colonial period in Nigeria is both long and recent. Mexico, for example, became independent in 1821, Nigeria only in 1960. Under authoritarian rule, the British strengthened chiefs' power so that they could rule through them for the purpose of extracting economic gain. You might call the government in this era highly interventionist. Economic gain was all Great Britain cared about. There was nothing like individual rights to keep free market capitalism in check. This set the expectation that people needed to accept the rule of their leaders without question. Individualism was also key in this era, but it wasn't helpful. It's the same idea as we have in Great Britain or the United States, but in Nigeria, it tended to make leaders think that they only had to look out for their own interests. Christianity is evenly split between North and South during the colonial period. And then there's a couple of major ethnic groups whose politics tend to dominate Nigeria. These three groups are the Hausa Fulani, the Igbo, and the Yoruba. Great Britain did their best to intensify these ethnic cleavages, pitting one against the other in order to better exploit the region's economic productivity. Now, as I mentioned, in 1960, Nigeria became independent, and it was parliamentary, at least from 1960 to 1979. But the problem was there were so many ethnic divisions in Nigeria that the parliamentary system was simply impossible to run because no one party could get anywhere close to enough seats for a majority. So in 1979, Nigeria switched to a presidential system with distinct branches. There's also been the problem of ethnic conflict and military rule since 1960. After independence, the Hausa Fulani allied with the Yoruba to dominate Nigeria's parliament. In 1966, however, a group of Igbo military officers staged a successful coup. This triggered another coup, and then a civil war. And from 1967 to 1970, the Igbo actually sought to break away from Nigeria and create their own country that they called Biafra. The country remained united, but honestly only because it fell under authoritarian military rule. Corruption is absolutely rampant in Nigeria. And this is as the result of years of individualistic and corrupt regimes. It is by far the most corrupt of any of our governments that we're going to look at. Now, in an effort to try to solve some of this, Nigerian leaders have recently set up a federalist system, delegating some power to the state and local governments in an effort to at least try to be more responsive. This didn't work at all, unfortunately, especially under the various military regimes. Nigeria is also a rentier state. Oil is its most important commodity, and unfortunately, many Nigerian dictators use Nigerian oil like their own personal ATM, exacerbating already existing problems. Nigeria tends to rent its oil fields out to a variety of different large oil conglomerates around the world, mostly British and American countries. This brings in a lot of money for Nigeria, but at tremendous cost, especially to the environment. In terms of political culture, it's similar to Mexico and China in that there's a lot of corruption. Also in Nigeria, political culture tends to follow ethnic religious groups. If we look at civil society, The state has for a long time tried to control civil society, but has largely failed. As a result, Nigeria actually has a vibrant civil society made up of religious organizations, labor groups, NGOs, and more. And these relate to the government mainly through clientelism and corporatism. Then there's also a question of how modern does Nigeria want to be? There's this conflict in Nigeria between the idea of modernity and the idea of tradition. During the colonial period, Nigeria was treated as subservient and taken advantage of. Since then, Nigeria has tried to return to its traditional values of collective responsibility. But often, due to corruption, this transition hasn't been easy and it hasn't particularly worked. Religious conflict is also very problematic in Nigeria, as the north is almost decisively Muslim and the south decisively Catholic. And as you can see from the slide, there's also a tremendous number of regional cleavages that break Nigeria up in a way that makes effective governance very challenging. Now, if we look at political and economic change, in pre colonial society, there were huge north south divisions. The Sokoto Caliphate in the north in 1808 dominated, while to the south, the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade and Christianity were the dominant forces for political change. In the colonial area, Britain used Southern elites to rule. Missionary schools were put in place to teach Western style education, though these were often resented by Northerners. This tended only to increase social class cleavages, which broke down completely also on religious and geographic lines, deepening the rift between the South and the North. In modern Nigeria, in 1966, the parliamentary style government was overthrown and replaced by a military dictatorship. This resulted in the rapid changing of governments becoming the norm. Elections in Nigeria are rarely seen as legitimate. Political corruption is all but institutionalized. And the national question, can Nigeria survive as an independent country, remains very much alive and well. If we think about political participation, the people of Nigeria face enormous challenges when it comes to democratization. Number one, there's a huge wealth gap. Most people are poor, but a very few are very, very wealthy. Plus, the economy is much less robust in Nigeria than it is in Mexico. So the chances to close that wealth gap are few and far between. Number two, health issues. One out of every 11 Nigerians suffers from AIDS or HIV. Worse still, the government has essentially abdicated responsibility for this crisis to NGOs that, while they do the best they can, don't have the resources of a government. Number three, literacy. Overall literacy is 59.6, but female literacy is only 49.7. The world literacy rate for women is 82.2. Low literacy for women only exacerbates an already problematic population issue that I'll discuss a little bit later on. Particularly in rural areas, political participation is entirely personal and based on clientelism. This has been called prebendalism, a system in which personalized rule basically dictates everything. Starting at the top, the government rewards its followers with public offices. Those public offices are treated like little kingdoms over which the office holder has complete control and from which the office holder then doles out benefits to his supporters. It's a vicious system that results in little to no accountability. As I mentioned before, Nigeria is one of the most fragmented societies in the world. There are a ton of cleavages, and worst of all, most of them coincide. Ethnicity, religion, and region all overlap. Making matters worse, urban and rural and social class divisions also overlap with each other. And this system of elites favoring fellow elites, especially in the urban areas, only continues to perpetuate systems of corruption and a complete lack of legitimacy. Civil society was very strong, as I mentioned, under colonial rule, and it remains so today. Many of these informal associations have huge centripetal impacts, encouraging Nigerian unity, and are, to some extent, all that hold an otherwise splintering state together. But on the other hand, some of these same civil society groups can exacerbate religious cleavages and cause society to devolve. There are likewise trade unions which operate amongst different Nigerian classes. It's very difficult to determine Nigerians' attitude toward voting. In 2003, over 66% of all eligible citizens turned out to vote. But given the corruption endemic to Nigeria, those statistics are highly suspect. In fact, rates of voting are almost impossible to determine because voters' fraud is so widespread. It's probably not surprising, therefore, that most Nigerians have a very negative view of their government. Over 80% of Nigerians say their government's management of the economy is bad or very bad. 67% say the economic condition of the country as a whole is very poor. Only 38% thought the election of 2011 was free, though that was actually an improvement. The biggest problem remains corruption. Of 146 countries, Nigeria ranks 142nd in transparency and lack of corruption. Nigeria's patron clientism simply permeates every level of government, and at every level, no one is held accountable. Since 1999, when the last major military dictatorship fell, protests have been on the rise in Nigeria. To an extent, this represents the resurgence of civil society. These protests often target international oil companies doing business in Nigeria. In 2002, a group of women occupied Chevron Texaco's Nigerian site for 10 days. This protest ended peacefully when the women's sons were given jobs and the women credit to start businesses, suggesting that many of these protests could have been avoided if Nigeria's oil wealth was more evenly distributed. However, these protests have also led oil companies to avoid Nigeria, often blaming the government for failing to control its own people. Starting in 2011, an Islamic militant group called Boko Haram began operating in northern Nigeria, where it took responsibility for scores of violence. Its stated goal is the institution of Sharia law in Nigeria. Boko Haram is not widely supported in Nigeria, not even amongst the Muslims, who in Nigeria tend to be moderate. Still, by 2013, Boko Haram had killed over 1,000 people. The government launched an all out assault in May of 2013 against the group, killing hundreds of civilians in the process. It was not until 2015 that a coalition of Chad, Niger, and Nigeria finally drove Boko Haram out of their entities, although the group still operates. Let's talk about linkage institutions for a moment. Today, Nigeria is formally federalist and democratic, though it doesn't always operate as such. In terms of parties as linkage, there's Nigeria's factionalism prevented the rise of one party like in Mexico. In fact, as I said before, at one point there were so many parties that it was difficult to determine a coherent political structure at all. The resulting myriad parties only served to deepen regional, ethnic, and religious cleavages. When it comes to the parties themselves, voter fraud makes it very difficult to determine just how much support anyone has. But the two biggest political parties are the People's Democratic Party, the PDP, and the All Progressives Congress, the APC. One recent and positive development has been the broadening source of support for both major parties. Eventually, if a major party can broaden its source of support, that might help to solve and heal some political cleavages. Now, the Independent National Election Commission requires a 5% showing in two-thirds of Nigerian states to be on the ballot. Unfortunately, while that might sound like a good idea, this government organization has been used in the past to keep political opponents off the ballot, even when they realistically got well more than the 5%. Since 2007, voter fraud in Nigeria has decreased, though it's still a pretty big problem, and elections have been held regularly. These are positive developments. In order to prevent a purely regional candidate from winning the presidency, Nigeria requires state support plus an overall plurality, as you've seen there. You can't just win by huge margins in one part of the country because they don't want a northern coalition or a southern coalition dominating, nor do they want one of the three major ethnic groups simply dominating. In the legislature, there are two houses. The Senate has 3 senators per state, of which there are 36 plus one for the federal capital. The House is 360 members, each from a single member district. Both are plurality votes. So, what you often get are very regional parties that then have to work together as coalitions. But it doesn't really matter because the legislative branch in Nigeria is extremely weak. So, really, who wins is much less important than the presidency. Interest groups are alive and well in Nigeria and have always been very important. Even when they had to work around the military and its control, these groups were important. Labor unions are very powerful today. The most important is the Nigeria Labor Congress, which in 2007 orchestrated a general strike across Nigeria. They won the strike, which was over a hike in fuel prices at the time. There are also a lot of business groups that organize based on professions. These were more important during the military regime years, however. There are many humanitarian groups active in Nigeria, all of them NGOs. Sometimes they join forces, sometimes they don't. There are university groups, civil liberties organizations, and professional groups who all work to try to make Nigeria more democratic with varying degrees of success. In contrast to most less developed countries, Nigeria actually has a very robust press. The media has helped a lot to spread news about corruption. Most of the newspapers, however, are in the South, and each of Nigeria's 36 states have their own television station. Now, the executive branch in Nigeria 100% dominates. There really aren't any checks to the presidential power. The president is the head of what we call a patrimonialism, which means the head of an intricate patron-client network. Every major position becomes a part of the president's patron clientele system. Great Britain put in place a massive bureaucracy that managed economic affairs, and today in Nigeria, this is even more bloated. And many jobs are simply political spoils. The person doesn't do anything. In addition, and I'm sure you could guess I was going to say this, the system is woefully corrupt. Nigeria has these things called parastals, and these are corporations owned by the state intended to provide commercial and public welfare system. In Nigeria, the boards of these quasi-government, quasi-private organizations are appointed by the government and its ministers, and hence they're just part of the patronage system. These can be utilities as well as major industries like steel. Because the major boards of these industries are appointed by the government, this is really an example of state corporatism. These corporations still serve as contact points between state and society, but because they are government controlled, they often fail in this function. For example, when one president formed a new electrical utility company designed to improve service called NEPA, the Nigerians joked that that stood for Never Expect Power Again. Again, rampant clientelism and corruption hampers just about all progress in Nigeria. The legislative branch is extremely weak in Nigeria. The Senate is modeled after the United States, so senators represent much smaller groups of people, but this also ensures that all ethnic groups are represented. Senators and representatives are both elected by a plurality. So, as I mentioned before, what this does is result in a lot of regional parties who have to work together as best they can. And the judiciary. So, right after independence, Nigeria had a strong and independent judiciary that used common law, because it was British, to reach decisions. They were known for solid decisions that were objective. But unfortunately, years of military rule has absolutely destroyed the judicial branch in Nigeria. Technically, judicial review exists because there's a constitution, but it exists in name only, at least as I'm recording this. Things are starting, it looks like, to get a little bit better, and the court system is trying to establish a rule of law, but again, with corruption so out of control, it's hard to make that happen. Let's also talk about the military. It should go without saying that the military in Nigeria is a political important force. Dictators did try at one point to distinguish between what they called military in the barracks and military in the government, but those distinctions were often hard to maintain. Now, the losses to Boko Haram starting in 2011 were a major blow to the Nigerian army's prestige, and so there's a question as to how politically influential it can continue to be. Issues. There are plenty. Let me give you a few. The first is what is referred to as the loyalty pyramid. Decisions since colonial times in Nigeria have been top down, with the assumption that the leader at the top of the pyramid will serve his interests first and everyone else's second. This has led to terrible corruption in Nigeria, which has been really, really hard to break. And then there's oil. Nigeria has a huge amount of oil, a tremendous amount of oil, but it is overly reliant on it. When oil prices go down, Nigerians suffer. However, one positive sign is that Nigeria's economy continues to grow, about 6% per year. In fact, Nigeria might pass South Africa as Africa's strongest economy in just a few years' time. Federalism is often seen as a major positive by most Nigerians. They like the ethnic representation that it provides. Unfortunately, if anything, federalism has divided Nigeria more and not brought it together as it was expected. Giving different ethnic groups important posts tends to make them think of these as hereditary. And then the person in that post has a tendency to support only their ethnic group. This then only heightens ethnic cleavages and divides Nigeria further. All of this is tied into the national question. Should Nigeria be one country? Most resources are in the Delta in the south, but Northerners want the profits from these resources redistributed. Southerners don't. So there's this big, big tension here about how we're going to manage a country with so many clear divisions. But let's be positive and end today on a positive note. There are some positive signs for Nigeria that result in a hope that it continues to democratize. Nigeria has been holding regular elections for a while now. These have been widely criticized, but they have been regular, and that matters. Nigeria's Freedom House score is now a 4 of 7, which means that it's partially free. And this is a positive attribute, especially compared to the rest of Africa, particularly West Africa, where Nigeria is really the only democracy now that remains. The media remains independent, civil society remains strong. The judiciary is trying to establish the rule of law. And critically, there have been several peaceful transitions of power in the last several decades. While all of these might seem like baby steps, in the end, there is, for the first time, maybe in the last 10 to 15 years, a sense that Nigeria truly can turn the corner.